What is the best diet for COVID or long COVID? I'm Dr. Eric Westman, and welcome back to a Dr. Westman Reacts. I was sent this video because everyone's interested in what is the best diet for infections like COVID and long COVID that's affecting a lot of people these days. But it comes from nutritionfacts.org. I've reviewed from their organization before. That's Dr. Michael Grieger, and I think it's Grieger, and they do have a plant-based bias. But let's see what he says.
What's the role of nutrition for both preventing and beating COVID-19? Nutrition-related myths on protection and treatment have been widely prevalent in this pandemic. And while there's no diet that completely prevents infection, there are certainly dietary steps we can take to minimize risk. Those with healthier diets in general seem to suffer less serious courses. But this appears to be an indirect benefit of lower rates of obesity and pre-existing medical conditions. I mean, that's great, but is there any diet that may have direct effects on the course of disease or susceptibility to infection in the first place? Well, plant-based diets have been shown to decrease the risk of suffering from other respiratory infections. In fact, plant-based seminaries during the pandemic of 1918 appeared to have been relatively spared. Why might a plant-based diet help? Vegetable nitrates, concentrated in dark green leafy vegetables, can be used to make nitric oxide, which is part of our lungs' first line of defense against infection. There are also polyphenol phytonutrients in plants that may directly inhibit viral infection. Then there are beneficial effects on our microbiome, which plays a key role in our system-wide immune function. Fiber-containing foods facilitate more of a symbiotic relationship with our gut bugs, whereas processed junk and animal foods can have the opposite dysbiotic effect. Fiber, concentrated in whole plant foods, is the single most anti-inflammatory food component, whereas saturated fat, concentrated in meat, dairy, and junk, is the most pro-inflammatory food component. And so, no surprise, those consuming more pro-inflammatory diets were at greater risk of suffering a severe course and of getting COVID-19 in the first place, up to nearly 12 times the odds, even after taking into account body weight, diabetes, and blood pressure. But this study only covered 60 COVID patients. How about 11,000 COVID patients?
Okay, it's going by pretty fast. Remember, association is not causation. Repeat that after me. Association is not causation, and these are studies of association. The interesting thing about the mechanisms for a plant-based diet to be anti-inflammatory and to be beneficial, there are actually papers that argue that a low-carb diet or a keto diet can also be anti-inflammatory and be anti-COVID. So, but that, I guess we're not talking about that, but I'm just trying to say you can build the case for any kind of diet to be possibly helpful. And what's not mentioned is that all of these sorts of diets that we study and recommend for people have very limited amounts of junk foods, of sugar and ultra-processed foods. So it may not be the type of diet itself, whether it's plant-based or meat-based or omnivorian, but it's actually the absence of the junk foods, the sugar and ultra-processed foods, that makes it beneficial. But so I'm reminded of let me tell you a story about a cocktail party I went to once, an academic one, and I brought a book of diets from around the world, and I had to give a little spiel. And I showed a picture of people in Okinawa, and the authors of the book went around the world and asked people to bring out what they ate for the week. And then they would take a picture of what they ate. They put it all into this book called Hungry Planet. So I put this picture of the diet and these people from Okinawa because they're one of the places where people live to be very long life. And when you look at the diet, basically you can see what you want to see. Because if you looked at this part of where the week food for the week was, well, there was fish. And there was animal products. So you look at this part of the diet, it was all on a table, then it looked very plant-based. And what was so funny about this cocktail party, again, among relatively educated academic people, one of the academics came up and pointed to the picture and said, "Ha, It's healthy because they're drinking beer. So that you can see what you want to see often when you're looking at a dietary pattern. And what I'm going to be talking about here is when you create a questionnaire that's not validated, it's something that you've come up with for the ad hoc use in a study, there are a lot of things that can go wrong or that can be mislabeled or misunderstood. But the first thing here is association is not causation.
Diet-associated inflammation increased the risk of getting COVID-19 infection, suffering a severe course, and dying from the disease. Might this help explain why the COVID death rates were 100 times lower in Africa? Can a plant-based diet help mitigate COVID-19? Let's find out. In this study of COVID-19 illness severity in the elderly in relation to vegetarian versus non-vegetarian diets, statistically, the non-vegetarians had up to like 20 times the odds of suffering a critically severe course of COVID, but that was based on only 9 vegetarians.
Stop right there. Wait a sec. So this is a published paper that's gone through the peer review process, and they're making a case based on 9 people in the study. Now, that doesn't even pass the sniff test of you're really searching to find or to make a case for something. So this was in the journal Frontiers in Nutrition. And I have to say the Frontiers group, they solicit papers and they want to get papers published. And if you have an insular or a echo chamber peer review system, it might get through the editor even and the peer review to say, well, there are only 9 people. So, but fortunately, Dr. Grieger picked that up, but the paper still was published.
Now here, a study of thousands of frontline healthcare workers across 6 countries found that those eating plant-based diets had 73% lower odds of suffering a moderate or severe course of COVID-19, and even combined with pescatarians who eat fish but no other meat still had significantly lower odds. The biggest spread was between those eating plant-based versus low-carb. Compared to plant-based healthcare workers, those eating low-carb, high-protein diets had nearly 4 times greater odds of suffering a serious infection. This may not seem surprising, given
Okay, hang on. Now, okay, so often in a pro-plant-based diet video, you'll see anti-low-carb, anti-red meat thrown in here and there gratuitously. And so let's take a look at this paper. And I'm sorry, it actually kind of brings me back to why we don't do this kind of research, because first of all, association is not causation, why I personally don't. But so here are the methods. This is the paper that you can download, go to PubMed, you can get it for free, and the first author here is Kim, Rebholz, and Hegde, and the title is Plant-Based Diets, Pescatarian Diets, and COVID-19 Severity, published in the BMJ Nutrition Preventive Health 2021, Volume 4, Issue 1, page 257. Or now you can search as the PubMed ID is 343-08134. So let's go to the methods. Always start with the method section. The study design, it was carried out, the case control study. Oh my goodness. This isn't even like a cohort study following people over time. It's more finding cases and controls and comparing, which has its own issues. But the cases and controls are now self-reported. So not only is whether you had COVID or not self-reported, but what diet you were on was self-reported. And so now how you capture that information is really important. So they asked people about COVID and said, since exposure, have you personally experienced symptoms consistent with a diagnosis of COVID? Fever, coughing, fatigue, loss of smell. So how did you actually know that they had COVID? They had COVID symptoms. Wait, did they have to have a test? I'm not even sure they had to have a test positive for COVID, but the symptoms were consistently. At the time of the study, the healthcare workers may have not had timely and adequate access to COVID-19 testing. So, okay, but let's say the diagnosis is accurate. Most people with those symptoms had COVID at that time. And so they asked how long the symptoms were and then categorized people into, after the fact, into mild, moderate, severe, based on some criteria that basically they came up with. And the number of days, so you're asking people about their symptoms and how long they last, categorizing people into COVID, mild, moderate, severe. Now let's get to the self-reported dietary patterns, because basically they came up with 11 choices. And it's not a validated type of instrument. You can actually come up with questionnaires to give it to hundreds and thousands of people and validate them, meaning what you ask is actually what you think you're asking for. And so they asked people if they were following a whole foods diet, a plant-based diet, or a keto diet, or a vegetarian diet, or a Mediterranean diet, or a pescatarian diet, or a Paleolithic diet, or a low-fat diet, or a low-carbohydrate diet, high-protein diet, other, or none of the above. And then it says, before analyses, we selected dietary patterns with sufficient yes responses, yes response of at least 100 individuals. Well, wait a sec, where did that come from? So now they're adjusting the information that they've received in an ad hoc manner without regard to potential biases introduced. What if, well, wait, did anyone say the keto? Was anyone following a Paleolithic diet? It actually doesn't say. Now, because they didn't show up in the tables, I'm assuming that they didn't have enough yes responses. And so we're doing a lot of assuming here, and then because there weren't enough people per group, they combined the whole foods, plant-based diets, and vegetarian diets into one category. There's a lot of like post collection of data massaging and categorization that you have to be careful it doesn't introduce a bias into what you're trying to find. And then combining, let's see, the low carb and high protein into another category. So they took these two responses, put them together into one to make the number of people in that category larger. So there were 483 people who were low carb, high protein. Well, so because, I'm trying to protect my tribe, and let's see what these people were actually eating. And I have to say, it was really nice of them to actually ask what people were eating. A lot of people don't ever ask. They just take people's words for it. And you can say you're doing an Atkins diet and people just believe you. And so let's see, on the did not follow plant-based diets, let's see, and followed a low-carb, high-fat diet. We're going down here to a table that basically says that the low-carb, high-protein folks were eating lots of carbs. So basically, the folks who were not eating plant-based diets were eating fruits and potatoes and nuts and legumes and sweets and desserts. And so those who were going to, let's see, you have to go to the supplement here. In the supplement, the supplemental table 2, they show the low carb, high protein people. There were 91 people saying that, who had 8 fruits per week, 8 servings, potatoes 2, legumes 2, 3 servings of nuts, refined grains, 7 servings per week, sweets and desserts 5. Wait a second, this isn't keto for sure. And there's really no description, no quantification of how many grams of carbs people had. Well, they didn't have that level of precision. So I'm a little, well, how should I say, underwhelmed by the methodology thus far, that you're asking self-report of symptoms that may or may not have been COVID, and then self-report of the diet that someone's having. And even then, this really, we don't know if it picked up people on the keto diet, although they asked about the keto and the Paleolithic diets. Those diets didn't show up in the analysis. And what were they thrown out? Were they so good and nobody had COVID that they just, well, we might as well just dismiss them? I'm not sure I can trust these investigators to know how to categorize these things without bias. They've also done other papers that end up being pro plant-based. And so I don't know. That was the largest study that Dr. Grieger is talking about, is proof that plant-based diets are better and better than low-carb, high-protein diets, but this has nothing to do with a keto diet. So if you're my patient, relax. This is not saying that low-carb diets are bad or gives you COVID. In fact, there are papers that give you the rationale for why an anti-inflammatory diet, like a plant-based one or a low-carb keto one, might actually reduce COVID. Now, I don't think anyone's done a paper like this, because these folks are creating questionnaires that are looking for plant-based eating. So if you were looking for keto eating specifically, you might actually find that the results look good, look favorable. Kind of like looking at that dietary pattern in Okinawa. If you looked at the meat and just focused on that, well, it was the meat that made them better, or was it the plants, or was it the alcohol? I don't know. Was it the absence of American junk food? That's another high on my list. So let's keep going.
For COVID-19 mortality, obesity, heart disease, high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes can be controlled or even reversed with a healthy enough plant-based diet and lifestyle. But the apparent plant-based protection went above and beyond. The greatly reduced risk was independent of all those conditions. The researchers suggest that a healthy diet rich in nutrient-dense foods may be considered for protection against severe COVID-19. The one food group most associated with lower symptom severity in one outpatient study was legumes, followed by grains, the top sources of dietary fiber. The investigators suggest that the anti-inflammatory effects of the short-chain fatty acids released by our fiber-feeding good gut bugs may explain the connection. The healthcare worker study enrolled a few thousand people, but Harvard researchers collected data from nearly 600,000 participants using a plant-based diet scoring system, where you get points for eating healthy plant foods, but points deducted for meat, eggs, junk, and dairy.
So if you create a questionnaire that's going to look for your type of diet, it's going to minimize or even ignore other types of diets, maybe undervalue, and you're looking for what you want to see. In some cases, it's almost like one of those Rorschach prints where the psychologist would ask you, what do you see in this ink blot? And then, it's based on what you have been experiencing. And here, so you go in with a score that says it's a plant-based, high plant-based, and it's a positive thing. It doesn't mean other diets, if you went in and looked, aren't good. They might be good. So you're creating a questionnaire that's actually kind of giving you what you want to see.
And indeed, those scoring higher not only had a significantly lower risk of suffering a severe course of COVID-19, but also significantly lower risk of getting infected in the first place. And again, this was after taking comorbidities into account alongside non-dietary risk factors such as exercise and smoking. Bottom line, the best available evidence suggests plant-based diets are beneficial in directly reducing the risk of severe COVID-19 symptoms and the risk of infection, even independent of other health-related factors.
It's an interesting strategy to quote the research paper, right? It makes it seem like it's not Dr. Grieger saying it, when you basically have these biased investigators writing it in journals that don't have outside peer review. That one that had 8 vegetarians in it should never have been published. I mean, if so, the quality of the research matters, the level of the journal, and here basically you see what you want to see.
A more Mediterranean-style diet may reduce the risk of infection by 22%, while an even more plant-based diet may cut infection risk in half. For dealing with long COVID, a plant-based diet has been suggested based on the abundance of data showing positive associations of plant-based diets with improved immune function, neurotransmitter balance, pain and inflammation reduction, improved sleep, and mental health. So in terms of lifestyle adjustments and long COVID management, large-scale promotion of plant-based eating may have the potential to improve physical and mental impacts, but this has yet to be put to the test.
It's not yet put to the test. These all need to be, so association is not causation. These association studies need to be turned into randomized trials, especially if you're going to say a plant-based diet is better than another diet. You're going to have that as the control group. not just the typical American diet. So I like that he put that in there, that it has not been put to the test.
There was a study that suggested those who eat more vegetables are less likely to end up depressed, and those who eat more nuts, beans, and whole grains may end up less depressed, anxious, and stressed after COVID, whereas stress levels were correlated with higher meat intake. But the only interventional studies are like this, showing a detrimental impact on high-fat, high-sugar diets, but that's in Syrian hamsters, though there's definitely some unhappy hamster lungs on the crappy diet. All in all, adopting a healthy plant-based diet may be a powerful tool to decrease the risk of severe COVID-19 and should be promoted as a public health safety measure. And what are the side effects? A delay in aging and decreased disease. Maybe this is the booster we need. After all, if real effort had gone into encouraging and incentivizing healthier diets and lifestyles, we would not only have saved many more lives from COVID-19, but we would also reduce future mortality from all major causes of death.
Well, I listened to and watched these, and at the end, why am I not doing it? It's so persuasive. And it's because there are many ways to be healthy, and I choose a different dietary pattern. So I'm afraid these studies, which show association and not causation, don't persuade me that the plant-based diet is the best one. It may be one of many, and we know that sugar and ultra-processed food are pro-inflammatory. That's probably the one you want to stay away from. I'll do another video soon on the keto diets. I was doing just a quick search on that, and keto diets and COVID, actually there's a bunch of information on that, and maybe that's the better diet, I don't know. So stay tuned for a future episode on my searching on COVID and the keto diet. I hope that's helpful. If you like this, please like and subscribe and ring the notification bell. If you don't have my top 10 tips on how to start keto the right way, please look in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, and check out adaptyourlifeacademy.com.